The knock came on an ordinary afternoon, the kind of afternoon I expected to forget. For more than 10 years, Eleanor had lived next door. She was the kind of neighbor people quietly wished for, warm without being intrusive, generous without making a show of it. Whenever someone was ill, she would appear with a container of homemade soup. Whenever our paths crossed outside, she always offered the same gentle smile and wave. But there was one thing Eleanor had never done. She had never simply appeared at my door without calling first. Until that afternoon. My name is Daniel. I am in my 60s now, and for most of my adult life, that was the only name the people around me knew. But there was another name. Rose. I had carried that name privately for almost 40 years. Rose belonged to a part of me I had never felt brave enough to introduce to the world. It was a piece of my identity that existed quietly behind closed doors, carefully protected from questions, judgment, and discovery. So when I opened the door and saw Eleanor standing there with her purse in one hand, something inside me immediately became alert. She smiled. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," she said. "Would it be possible to borrow your ladder? Mine isn't safe anymore." That was all. Just a ladder. An ordinary request from an ordinary neighbor. "Of course," I replied. I went to get it, although I couldn't explain why my hands suddenly felt slightly unsteady. Eleanor thanked me, called me Daniel, and carried the ladder back to her house. A few days later, she returned it. The entire exchange lasted perhaps 30 seconds. There were no questions. No suspicious glances. No awkward pause. Nothing that would have suggested she knew anything about me beyond what everyone else knew. And yet, after she walked away, I couldn't shake the strange feeling that something had changed. I told myself I was imagining it. Then life carried on. Weeks passed. One morning, however, I opened my front door and found a small parcel sitting on the welcome mat. My name was written across the top in Eleanor's unmistakable handwriting. There was no explanation. I brought it inside and left it on the kitchen table. For several minutes, I simply stared at it. Then I opened it. Inside was a layer of delicate tissue paper. Beneath it lay a silk scarf. It was beautiful. The color was somewhere between deep ocean blue and emerald green, a rich shade of teal that seemed to change slightly whenever the light touched it. The fabric was soft, elegant, and clearly handmade. There was also a folded note. I unfolded it. The first line read, "I have spent quite some time thinking about our brief interaction the other day." My heartbeat quickened. I kept reading. Eleanor explained that before retiring, she had worked for many years as a seamstress and designer. The scarf had been made by her own hands long ago. She had kept it tucked away for years, never finding the right person to give it to. Then I reached the sentence that made me stop. "I believe I have finally found that person." I read it again. Then again. She continued. "No explanation is required. No conversation is expected. You owe me nothing. If you would like the scarf, it is yours." And near the bottom of the page were the words I had spent nearly 40 years terrified someone might say. "Your secret is safe with me." I couldn't move. I just sat there. For decades, I had convinced myself that if anyone ever discovered Rose, everything I had built would come crashing down. My friendships. My reputation. My marriage. My ordinary life. The careful boundary I had created between Daniel and Rose. I had always imagined discovery as a catastrophe. But Eleanor had discovered something about me, and instead of turning away, she had placed a gift in my hands. She hadn't demanded an explanation. She hadn't asked me to defend myself. She hadn't treated me like a problem that needed solving. She had simply offered kindness. For the first time, I wondered whether the disaster I had feared for so long had existed mostly inside my own imagination. The world hadn't ended. A silk scarf had arrived instead. For several days, I kept the package on my dresser. Sometimes I would pick up the scarf and let the silk slide slowly between my fingers. Other times, I would unfold Eleanor's note and read it again. Each time, the same thing happened. The fear became a little quieter. Eventually, I knew there was someone else I had to tell. My wife. Susan and I had been married for nearly 30 years. She knew almost everything about me, the habits I couldn't break, the moods I tried to hide, the things that made me laugh, the things that kept me awake at night. But Rose was different. Rose was the one part of myself I had kept locked away from everyone. Even her. The conversation happened at our kitchen table one evening. I placed the scarf in front of Susan. Then I handed her Eleanor's letter. She read it slowly. When she reached the final line, she folded the paper carefully and placed it on the table. Then she looked at me. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, she smiled. I've been waiting a long time for this conversation. I stared at her. What do you mean? She folded her hands together. When you love someone for long enough, she said, you notice things. My stomach tightened. She told me that years earlier, she had walked into my study unexpectedly and seen enough to realize there was something beneath the surface. She hadn't understood everything. She hadn't known the name Rose. She hadn't known the full story. But she had sensed that there was a part of me I was struggling to protect. And instead of confronting me, she did something I had never expected. She waited. She didn't interrogate me. She didn't demand answers. She didn't force me to reveal something before I was ready. She trusted that, if I ever wanted to tell her, I would. Now, sitting across from her, I finally did. I told her everything. I told her about Rose. About the first time I had understood that this hidden identity was more than a passing thought. About the years I spent keeping it separate from Daniel. About the loneliness. The fear. The endless calculations of what I could say, what I could wear, where I could go, and what I needed to hide. I told her how exhausting it was to live with two versions of myself and pretend they were strangers. Susan listened. She never interrupted. She never looked away. When I finally ran out of words, the kitchen became completely silent. Then she reached across the table. I want you to understand 4 things, she said. I nodded. First, I'm not surprised. I felt my eyes sting. Not because I knew everything, she continued. I didn't. But because I've known you long enough to recognize something important when I see it. She paused. Second, I'm not afraid. Her words landed gently. The person I married hasn't disappeared. I just understand more about that person now. I looked down at the table. Then she told me the third thing. I am sad. My heart sank. But not because Rose exists, she said. I'm sad because you spent so many years believing you had to hide her. Keeping a part of yourself locked away for decades leaves wounds, even when nobody else can see them. Then she reached for my hand. And the 4th thing is this. She squeezed my fingers. I want her to have space. 4 simple words. But they broke something open inside me. Space. Permission. Acceptance. For nearly 40 years, I had believed Rose could only exist in secrecy. Now I realized I had been wrong. Eleanor had given Rose safety. Susan had given Rose room. Neither woman demanded an explanation. Neither asked me to justify who I was. They simply chose compassion. A few days later, I wrote Eleanor a letter. Not an email. Not a text. A real letter on paper. I thanked her for the scarf. I thanked her for seeing something in me that I had spent most of my life hiding. But most of all, I thanked her for setting in motion a conversation I had once believed would never happen. A week later, her reply arrived. Her handwriting was as neat as ever. She admitted that she had hesitated before leaving the package outside my door. She had wondered whether she was crossing a boundary. Then she decided that sometimes compassion requires taking a small risk. She wrote, "If the gift was unwelcome, we would simply remain neighbors. But if it helped you even a little, then it was worth leaving." I read that sentence several times. At the very end, Eleanor added something that made me smile. "The scarf looks exactly as though it was made for Rose." I kept that letter too. I thought the story ended there. It didn't. A few days later, another envelope arrived. It was from Eleanor. I sat at the kitchen table before opening it. By then, I knew her letters were never careless. She thought about every word before putting it on paper. This one was short. She told me that she had always believed certain things people create seem to have a destination of their own. Sometimes the maker knows where something belongs. Sometimes they don't. But somehow, the object waits until the right moment. The scarf, she said, had always felt like one of those things. She remembered making it during a quiet winter many years earlier. She remembered running her fingers over the silk before choosing it. She remembered selecting that particular shade of teal because it seemed to carry 2 qualities at once, calmness and confidence. At the time, she had no idea who would eventually wear it. She simply knew she needed to make it. Years went by. People admired it. Friends suggested she give it away. Family members encouraged her to donate it. More than once, she nearly did. But every time she picked it up, something stopped her. So she folded it again and put it away. Waiting. Waiting for a person she had never met. Waiting for a story she didn't yet know existed. Waiting for Rose. At the bottom of the page, Eleanor had written one final thought. I don't remember every word of that final sentence. I remember what it made me feel. For most of my life, I had thought the safest way to survive was to keep Rose hidden. But sometimes the thing we protect in darkness isn't asking to be hidden forever. Sometimes it is simply waiting for someone kind enough to open the door. And sometimes, after 40 years of silence, all it takes is a knock from a neighbor, a borrowed ladder, and a scarf that was apparently waiting all along. Perhaps some things know where they belong long before we understand it ourselves. I read that sentence several times. For some reason, it stayed with me. For most of my life, I had thought of Pearl as something that needed to be controlled. A secret that had to be carefully contained. A private room inside myself that I could enter only when no one was looking. But what if I had misunderstood her all along? Maybe Pearl had never been waiting for permission. Maybe she had simply been waiting for the right moment. For the right people. For a little more courage. For a world that wasn't quite as frightening as the one I had created inside my own mind. The scarf no longer lives at the bottom of a box. It isn't hidden underneath old clothes or pushed behind things I rarely use. Susan hung it inside the wardrobe, on a small hook attached to the door. The first time I saw it there, she smiled. This feels like where it belongs, she said. Such a simple sentence. But I understood what she was really saying. The scarf belonged there. And maybe Pearl did too. Nothing about my life changed overnight. There was no dramatic transformation. No sudden moment when everything became easy. Instead, the changes came quietly. Susan began suggesting that we make time for Pearl, not as some extraordinary occasion, not as a secret event that had to be planned weeks in advance, but simply as another part of our life together. The first afternoon was awkward. I was aware of every movement, every sound. Every glance in the mirror seemed to carry 40 years of memories with it. I felt as though I were learning how to breathe in a room I had been afraid to enter. The second time was easier. The third was easier still. Eventually, something surprising happened. I stopped thinking about whether I was doing it correctly. I wasn't pretending anymore. I wasn't performing a version of someone else. I was simply being myself. And that's when I learned something I wish I had understood much earlier. Authenticity doesn't always arrive like a thunderclap. Sometimes it grows quietly. It develops through repetition. Through trust. Through the ordinary moments that slowly teach us we are safe. Real life isn't usually transformed by grand speeches or dramatic revelations. It changes in kitchens. In gardens. During quiet afternoons. In the small spaces between people who love each other. A few weeks ago, I was outside tending to the flowers in our front garden. The weather was mild, and I had the teal scarf loosely wrapped around my neck. Nothing about the afternoon seemed unusual. Children were riding bicycles down the street. Somewhere nearby, a lawnmower hummed. Birds moved between the trees. Someone was washing a car. Just an ordinary neighborhood on an ordinary day. Then I looked across the street. Eleanor was working in her garden. For a moment, our eyes met. She smiled. There was no hesitation in it. No secret message. No question. No reminder of the letter she had once left on my doorstep. It was simply the smile of one person recognizing another. A smile that said, I see you. And I'm still here. I smiled back. Then we both returned to our gardening. Nothing else happened. And somehow, that nothing felt enormous. For decades, I had imagined being discovered as the moment everything fell apart. I had pictured rejection, judgment, humiliation, the collapse of friendships and the destruction of the life I had built. I had spent years preparing myself for the worst possible ending. Instead, I found something I had never prepared for. Compassion. A neighbor who offered me understanding without demanding an explanation. A wife who met my truth with patience instead of fear. And a scarf that had somehow waited quietly for the person who would finally wear it. The fear I carried for 40 years had always spoken with certainty. It told me exactly what would happen if anyone knew. It was wrong. Fear has a strange talent for making predictions sound like facts. It prefers disaster because disaster feels predictable. Hope is harder. Hope requires trust. Hope requires believing that another person might respond differently than we expect. For most of my life, I trusted fear because fear seemed safer. I don't trust it quite so much anymore. Sometimes I think about that afternoon when Eleanor knocked on my door. It lasted only a few seconds. She needed a ladder. I opened the door. We exchanged a few words. She took the ladder home. That was it. There was no dramatic revelation. No confrontation. No life-changing announcement. And yet, somehow, that tiny moment became the first link in a chain that changed everything. I had spent decades building an elaborate system in my mind. I calculated risks. I anticipated questions. I imagined suspicious looks. I rehearsed explanations I never had to give. I prepared for every possible disaster. There was one possibility I never included in my calculations. Kindness. I never imagined that someone might notice without judging. That someone might understand without demanding. That someone might see the hidden part of me and respond with tenderness instead of rejection. I never accounted for Eleanor. I never accounted for Susan. And I certainly never accounted for love. Love doesn't behave like a calculation. It doesn't follow the rules of probability. It doesn't care how many years we've spent preparing for the worst. Sometimes it simply walks through the door. And when it does, every number changes. The teal scarf is still hanging inside the wardrobe. I see it almost every day. And whenever I do, I think about all the things that can wait quietly for years. A conversation. A truth. A person. A moment of courage. A life that has been postponed. The scarf waited patiently. Pearl waited much longer. But she isn't waiting anymore. She isn't hidden behind a locked door. She isn't something I need to apologize for. She isn't a secret I carry like a burden. She is part of me. And she is finally living. Perhaps that is what the scarf was really waiting for. Not the right person, not the right place, but the right moment. The moment when fear finally became smaller than hope. The moment when hiding was no longer necessary. The moment when I realized that the life I had spent so many years protecting was not destroyed by the truth. It became larger because of it. And now, when another ordinary afternoon arrives, I don't fear it. I welcome it. Because after nearly 40 years of waiting, Pearl no longer needs extraordinary moments. She has something better. She has ordinary ones. And perhaps that was the life she had been waiting for all along.